Hello, welcome to Conversations in Calvinism. I'm Dan Chappa, and I'm joined as always by my great friend Turretin Fan. It's good to be with you as always. How's it? How have you been?
I've been doing well. Been happy to be on here again with you, discussing some debate preparation material. And as you highlighted in our last episode, I think we have two debates that are coming up. They're coming up kind of close together, and so it makes sense for us to kind of go. And some of the material will be on one debate preparation, and some will be on the other debate preparation. And I guess I saw somebody, Kurt, actually commented on the last episode, which was talking about the assumption, and he's like, "Oh, good, I don't have to listen to this one." He's got enough other things to do, I guess, than to listen to all these preparatory videos. But this one would be a good one if he's interested. I don't know; he may already feel like he knows this part. He's spent thousands of hours studying the Macellanians, so there's that. But the title of today's episode, "Defining Semi-Pelagianism," is because there is some question about what does the term mean. So in some previous episodes, we've looked at the Second Council of Orange and the canons there. We've looked at, in a previous episode, at the Council of Carthage 418 and the 8 canons that are relevant there. We have not, however, gone through, I don't think, at least not recently, we haven't gone through the dictionary definitions and seen how do dictionaries define the terms. So without additional ado, let's see. So this is me sharing the screen, which is just currently at the blog, turretinfan.blogspot.com. An article I posted here, which what I've done is I've gone to the 1913 edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. It is intended at the time to be fairly exhaustive. It's 100 years old. It was intended to be fairly exhaustive, but it's built around a system of defining the words and providing usage supporting the definition that's provided. So it was a massive undertaking. It's a multi-volume set. This is from the 9th volume and page 444 of that volume. And it was reprinted several times. This is the 1978 reprinting, but it was originally published in 1913. And none of the examples are from after 1913. So I'm pretty sure they just reprinted the text. They didn't update the usage. So we're getting a snapshot of an historical definition from 1913 of how the term was used in English, keeping in mind that dictionaries have the power to tell us how the words are used. They're not authorities over the language saying you have to use it this way. You can't ever change the definition. This is the one and only definition or anything like that. They're not inspired or infallible or anything like that. So with all those qualifications, here's the definition, and they have semi-Pelagian and semi-Pelagianism as separate entries, but adjacent to one another. So I've just copied them both in here. And the highly useful definition pertaining to the semi-Pelagians or semi-Pelagianism it's an adjective definition. So it doesn't tell you that much in itself, and we'll come down to the other usage in a moment. And then there's a B meaning, an adherent of semi-Pelagianism. Again, you're defining the word semi-Pelagian by semi-Pelagianism or pertaining to semi-Pelagians or semi-Pelagianism. And then there's no C definition that fills it in. So not the most useful definition by itself in the world, but there are a number of uses you can see here they've quoted from. I apologize that the quality is not always perfect. Some of these, the fonts they used were very small, and the ink, I think the ink blurred, or the image that's scanning this, the scanner may have had some issues over time. Some of the italic fonts, you can see like the P, the bottom part of the P, when it says second parallel, I'm pretty sure it's second parallel, but the P is broken a bit there. And meanwhile, the 2 in the 1626 is one hopeless blob of ink. So I hope it's readable to folks. But you can see that there's some of this is very polemical use, and this first example is such a use. It says no better than a half-faced groat of the semi-Pelagian alloy. So a groat is a fairly worthless, if I recall correctly, a groat's a fairly worthless coin. A half-faced one would mean it's like not, it's poorly made, and it's not from the authentic alloy that it's supposed to be made of, but from some semi-Pelagian alloy. So you can see it's a highly polemic usage that they've selected as their first pick. I don't know, it says second parallel. I'm not sure what that's a reference to. Somebody else may have a better take on that. Then the second one refers to a semi-Pelagian and a popish faction set on foot to the danger of this church and state, whose tenets are liberty of free will. At least with this, finally, this is again fairly polemical. You can see that, you know, they're tying semi-Pelagian and popish factions together, and the use of popish rather than Catholic tells you this is coming from some kind of non-Roman Catholic use in the late 1600s. But supposedly this is a danger to the church and state, presumably to the 1600s. Would that have been already Jacobean, or would that be Carolingian? I'm not sure, but it's after 1611, but it's I'm not sure whether it's already Carolingian or not. But anyway, the tenets that identified here are just liberty of free will, which, you know, at least you have something now to go on besides just semi-Pelagian, but liberty of free will is a pretty broad topic. So the next use from the 1700s, they said they had embraced the semi-Pelagian doctrine before Cassian, which is significant because Cassian is often associated with semi-Pelagianism. And I don't know the rest of the context, if it's saying that someone literally was holding to semi-Pelagianism before Cassian, which would suggest that Cassian is not kind of the father of semi-Pelagianism. But it shows this connection, at least, between semi-Pelagianism and Cassian. Let's see. Sorry, I'm all over the place with my cursor. Early 1800s, they enabled every sublapsarian and superlapsarian and semi-Pelagian clergyman to build himself a neat brick chapel. So this one seems a little bit less polemical in its usage, but it seems to be just trying to exhaust various categories, and semi-Pelagian is put as an alternative to sublapsarian and semi-lapsarian. Oh, Nick has a helpful comment that James died in 1625, so 1626 would be Carolingian then, not Jacobean. Thank you, Nick, much appreciated. Let's see. But again, doesn't tell us much about what it is, except that presumably a sublapsarian or superlapsarian is a different category from semi-Pelagian. And then finally, another reference in 1845 to Cassian being generally attributed the honor or disgrace of founding the semi-Pelagian school. Wow. But interestingly, they've chosen this together with somebody else who supposedly held a reference to someone who supposedly held this doctrine before Cassian. So you can see there's some cracks in the building of, you know, attributing everything to Cassian. Then under the B usage for the adherent of semi-Pelagianism, a reference this time from 1600 saying, if his grace did no otherwise draw our minds than Pelagians and semi-Pelagians imagined. So there's some Hooker in this context is talking about, and this is from his works as published in 1888, but written around 1600, talking about the relationship of grace and the drawing of our minds to both Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism. Then 1607, some papists who are in this point, as they're rightly called, semi-Pelagians, they acknowledging original corruption, yet do limit it. So now we finally have a reference to what I view as another facet of semi-Pelagianism, which relates to this question of original corruption. They acknowledge it, but limit it, rather than just outright denying it. In this, I don't know who Hieron is, but his works, I suppose, is somebody notable if he has works that are published later. In the event, 1744, the semi-Pelagians think that an assisting grace is necessary, but that the first turn of the will to God is the effect of a man's own choice. And this is one of those. This might become an interesting aspect of the debate, because there's a question of whether the priority of grace and man's own choices, with the high Augustinian view being that man's choice is brought about by grace, as opposed to being enabled by grace, or somehow grace coming alongside of man's choice, or even responsive to man's choice. Now, the detailed explanation, this is just a one-liner, so the detailed explanation is not here. But this question about assisting grace, having room for it, but still having room for man's own choice, is part of this 1744 usage. And finally, within this definition, Marcus Dodds, from the Encyclopedia Britannica, he says a similar scheme was adopted by Cassian of Marseille. Hence, semi-Pelagians are often spoken of as Massileans. Massileans. I think that's the right pronunciation. Then, the semi-Pelagianism is a much shorter entry and just says a doctrine intermediate between Augustinianism and Pelagianism, taught by Cassian of Marseille in the 5th century. So at least this is a little bit better than the definitions that were provided for semi-Pelagian. Now we have something to hang our hats on. But this is a very broad wording, a doctrine intermediate between Pelagianism and Augustinianism, but then taught by Cassian of Marseille in the 5th century really narrows it down and suggests either that this is an appositive. In other words, the idea is that there is some doctrine that lies between Augustinianism and Pelagianism, and that doctrine was taught by Cassian, or that Cassian's own views should be taken as the touchstone of semi-Pelagianism. It quotes here again to a sermon, looks like it was published in 1640, but provided in 1626. It says, not disposed by preventing grace. Preventing in that sense means preceding. Prevenient or preventing doesn't mean stopping grace, it means preceding grace. Without the use of subsequent grace, by antecedent and anticipant, without concomitant and auxiliant grace, that is semi-Pelagianism. Unfortunately for me, at least, this sentence, even once you get past the preventing means going before, the sentence is hard to follow. So maybe I should read, if I want to find out more about that, I maybe need to read the actual sermon, which hopefully is still out there somewhere. Then there's a section on Jansenism, or I don't know if it's a work on Jansenism or just it looks like it's an entry on Jansenism. He says it's semi-Pelagianism to say that Jesus Christ died or shed his blood for all men in general. So this undifferentiated atonement concept is being labeled here as semi-Pelagianism. And then Marcus Dodds in 1885 again, and he says the differentia of semi-Pelagianism is the tenet that in regeneration, the divine and the human will are cooperating or synergistic coefficient factors. So huge mouthful, but that's the 1913 definition.
So
yeah, go ahead.
So if you could go back up to that, the one you were just looking at with where it talks about auxiliary grace. Okay, so it's not disposed by prevenient grace without use of subsequent grace. So the grace that comes after, by antecedent, preceding, and anticipant without concomitant and auxiliary grace. That is semi-Pelagianism. So that's almost like a complete denial of grace, wall to wall.
Well, it's not disposed by the prevening grace.
Yeah.
The point being, I would guess, I'm not sure, but my guess, I think it's a mouthful. My guess is that he's saying you get some grace, but then it's up to your free will how you use it.
I don't think so. But okay, so the interesting thing is that without the use of subsequent grace, by antecedent and anticipant. So I don't. Okay. So here's the thing. thank you for all of that. It's interesting to see the way different people used it. The topic is complex, and my concern with this approach is that you're reliant on kind of snippets of the way different people used it on how well they actually understood the topic. And without like a lot of background information, and the only time when they actually provide an explanation, it's well, in this section, there's a couple of them, and they're just straight polemical, right? So let's take Jansen, right? It's semi-Pelagian to say that Christ died or shed his blood for all men in general. Where in the business, where did that come from? What's the historical source? Why did Jansen think that? Obviously, Jansen himself was getting confused, accused of Stoicism and Manichaeism and stuff like that. So he's slinging mud in any direction he can while he goes down with his own ship. So, why should we put reliance on these sources when they don't explain themselves? When they do, we say, well, we don't know what he's saying, or there's some obvious bias in these sources. So in other words, how is this approach helpful?
Okay. I suppose that there's an interesting question of kind of who gets to define words that's of interest. And I guess there's an argument to be made that there could be kind of popular level understandings of words and specialist understandings of words. There could be broader polemical uses of words, and there could be narrower technical uses of words. Trying to think of a great example of that is when my buddy Matt Slick refers to people who are not atheists, but are instead Christians who disagree with him on issues relating to the role of man's will in salvation. He refers to them as humanists. That's a pretty polemical description, and it doesn't accord with the technical meaning of humanism, even as it's laid out on his own CARM website. So if you go to his website, it's like it's a species of atheism, and it kind of gets a really standard, here's what humanism is. It's a philosophical system that's atheistic, that has all these other characteristics and so forth. So he's using it in a polemical way, maybe to make a point or a rhetorical point. I don't know what, I mean, that's between why he's doing it. That's not for me to say, I guess, but it's a polemical usage. I can describe it that way, and it's distinct from the technical usage. What's the value of going to a dictionary from 100 years ago to talk about the meaning of this term semi-Pelagian? I suppose one value of it is to recognize that it's soaked in polemical usage. I mean, it's soaked in it. It's almost begun as a polemical term. Like when Beza brings it out, it's not mentioned here, and Beza's usage isn't one of the ones they've mentioned, interestingly. But when Beza brings it out, he does seem to bring it out as having some descriptive intent to it, but nevertheless as having a polemical edge to it. Some of these that we saw have a really hardcore polemical edge to them, like this original one about the what is the first one he picked? This no better than a half-faced groat of the semi-Pelagian alloy. Like that's just, you can almost see the person snarling as he says the words. It's just a pejorative term that's being thrown in there. On the other hand, there are some more not frothing at the mouth uses that are placed in here, such as the encyclopedia saying that Cassian is attributed the honor or disgrace of founding the semi-Pelagian school. That's a less polemical use. And then the other question is so there's this range of, there's from the polemical end to something that looks more neutral. The fact that it's honor or disgrace suggests some kind of neutrality in the way that it's being worded here. But in that context, what's the value? Well, I suppose the value would be, since we have this debate over the label, is when people use this label of Latent Flowers or Soteriology 101, are they just using it as a polemical label, just as a way of disparaging him? Are we just saying the Soteriology 1 website is just no greater than than some semi-Pelagian alloy? It's just like some fake penny, not even fully printed. This idea. Or are we saying, actually what we're saying is that his views are sub-Augustinian. They fall short of Augustinian excellence or something like that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So I just gotta come out. I don't think yeah. So if you want to do historical theology, you need to look at history. You can't just go with the opinions of people and like how they're using the term. I think this whole approach is going to get you just dismissed, and as well, frankly, as it should be, right? Because no one doubts that the term has been misused to attack people. Everyone understands that. So, there it is. So, if you're interested in historical theology, you got to look at the history.
So, as you can probably guess, the usage that's described in the Oxford English Dictionary is about a 300-year window of history. So, if you're talking about the historical usage of the term, this is the kind of thing you do have to go to for that.
So if your position is simply, Calvinists have mislabeled people as semi-Pelagians for hundreds of years, no one doubts that. We all know that Calvinists have mislabeled people for hundreds of years. That's the problem. So just because they haven't ever corrected it doesn't make it right.
So if that's the case, that's the case. But you will note that a lot of these, well, I don't know what percentage, some of these are Calvinistic people who are making these comments. Some of these are the Jansenism debate. Those are not Calvinistic people. I mean, they're Calvinistic in the fact that they share similar Augustinian views, but they're Roman Catholics. They're not Protestants at all.
Yeah, and that position got itself condemned by the Catholic Church for being Stoic.
I'm not sure what that has to do with the assertion that this is just the way that Calvinists have used the phrase.
We could say the way Stoics have used the phrase. I mean, if we want to start slinging mud, let's go ahead and start slinging mud. But that's all that's going on here. Why not focus on the historical substance? In other words, to me, a better approach is to look at the canons of Orange, and that seems to be the better way to define semi-Pelagianism. But I guess it's up to you. But if this is the road you want to go down, so be it. No one doubts that Calvinists have been mislabeling people as semi-Pelagians for hundreds of years, and they have not corrected their errors. Okay, so what? And you can join them.
Okay, well, in terms of whether or not it's a mislabeling or just a correct labeling, that's a different question than whether this is the label that's been used for these views. The question of whether the label is the right label or the wrong label is one thing, and whether or not it's been used this way before is a different one. So I don't know whether Leighton's followers are aware of the fact that this has a history of usage that goes back to the 1600s or even the 1500s, or if they think that this is something that, some mean, talking head on YouTube came up with last week. I don't know what they think about that. So whether they acknowledge this is a label that's been consistently used for hundreds of years, I don't know. I don't take that for granted, but I guess the point that's served by a historical inquiry over the usage just establishes that, in fact, there is a long usage, with the term being brought out against a variety of different aspects of the opposing theology. And generally speaking, it's fair to say that opposing theology is a theology different from what Augustine offers.
Okay, I've just going on record. I don't think anything you just did here is is really all that helpful. But okay, if you think it's helpful, that's fine. Yeah.
All right. So what I distilled this down into about 10 different aspects. The 10 aspects are that this is a theology associated with John Cassian of Marseille, which, when we look at it that way, that gives us at least what I think you're talking about when you say a historical theology viewpoint. This gives us a hook into that, because we can then say, well, if this term is being linked to John Cassian of Marseille, what did John Cassian of Marseille believe? And then we should probably go and check, what does he actually say, as opposed to just anything that we don't agree with. Well, that must be what if we called it John Cassianism instead of semi-Pelagianism? Well, then that wouldn't resolve the issue, unless I don't think it would resolve the mislabeling issue unless John Cassian of Marseille actually held those things. We call it Cassianism and Cassian didn't hold it, then we've been mislabeling it for years. And maybe people have. That's not my, that's one concern, but it's not the only concern for me. Like with Nestorianism, I'm okay with saying, well, maybe we've been mislabeling it as Nestorianism for years. It's still wrong, and we're going to keep using the label because we've been using it so long. But maybe it is a mislabeling.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the mislabeling that I'm afraid that I've been just watching your last episode and that sort of thing. I mean, keeping a strong distinction between the law and the gospel is important, and the view of justification by faith versus condignant merit through works. And if we blur those lines, we're going to make some blunders. And then in addition to that, the deviation from the golden Augustine whatever versus prevenient grace, that seems like a problem that we keep coming back to. And every time I try to point that out to you, it doesn't work. So it seems to me on those three issues, you either using historical theology versus the misuse of Calvinists, a clear distinction between law and gospel and justification by faith alone, and then deviation from Augustine's irresistible grace formulas versus focus on prevenient grace. On those 3 points, we're not going to get there. We probably just won't be able to agree with each other, and I will always think that you're just strawmanning people.
Okay, on some of those points, there might be value in having a more focused discussion. I don't on the whether or not this is just something unique to Calvinists, or it's a term that's used outside of Calvinism for similar things. We can have, that's a point to discuss. But if the question about whether or not I'm trying to remember the exact way you worded it. Was it a law gospel distinction that you were talking about, or what was the wording? Law gospel.
Yeah. Your entire discussion on the bulk of your discussion on the Council of Carthage just blurred past the law and gospel distinction, as if justification by faith is nothing.
So I think we should have at some point a discussion about why in the world is that. I think that's a point that's worthy of its own discussion, of why not bring the law gospel distinction into this definition, or why not make it the central feature of this distinction.
The Council of Carthage was in its own context, dealing with the issues at that time, and if we just take what they're talking about in terms of work salvation and apply it over to a context where somebody holds to justification by faith, we're going to end up with problems. And that's but I've been trying to persuade you on that point unsuccessfully, repeatedly. I don't know. Anyways, I'm not convincing you, but I still think it's very, very important. Does a person believe in justification by faith alone, or do they believe in contingent merit? And I've shown that from the historical sources, not from the opinions of people, hundreds of years or 1,000 years later, but from the combatants at the time. That's the issue. That, anyways. So, Pelagius said, okay, we come to faith and baptism, and then from there, all our past sins are forgiven. Okay, from that point forward, you either have to be perfect, sinlessly perfect, to get to heaven, or your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds, like the scales of justice. Like that was his literal position. That's the context that we're dealing with. And so when it talks about God's grace is necessary for what, the for what is very, very, very important. And when it starts talking about works, then we know what context we're in. And that's why those definitions matter. And you can't just take and copy and paste that and put it to, well, what about faith?
I think I hear your objection, and I do. As I said, I think it might be worthy of its own discussion.
Okay. All right.
So
I'll pause. I'll silence myself now. But I've registered my 3 objections.
what was? I'm sorry. So the first objection was that this is all about what Calvinists have done. The second one was the law, or the law gospel distinction, and the third one was.
So okay. So the first objection is, okay, we got to go to the historical sources rather than the way Calvinists have used it for the last, let's say, 300 years or so. The second is that we've got to keep a clear distinction between the law and gospel. Is somebody justified by faith or justified through contingent merit? The third is the whole issue of, is it just something that's less than Augustine's doctrine, or is it about prevenient grace versus cooperating grace?
So
those are my 3 issues with the way you've been using the term.
Okay. And my summary response on those 3 issues was, 1, I agree in principle. I agree that simply the long use of something doesn't justify it. It's the fact that it's been used this way for 500 years or coming on 500 years doesn't make it right. It makes it consistent if it's been used consistently that whole time the same way, but it doesn't make it right. If it was wrong from the beginning, then it's still wrong now, and it didn't become right over time. So, and then, well, the second one, I think I hear what you're saying. I don't think that what you're saying is relevant to this particular debate, but I want to hear you out more on it because I want to hear where you're coming from. I agree that the difference between law and gospel is very important, and that justification is very important. I just don't think it's important to the question of defining Pelagianism or defining semi-Pelagianism. And that's something where maybe you'll have the opportunity to persuade me more and change my mind. I'm not sure. And then the third one, the question of how broad can this term semi-Pelagianism be? Can it be, to come back to this very, very broad statement where it says a doctrine intermediate between Augustinianism and Pelagianism. And then it says taught by Cassian of Marseille in the 5th century. Without the taught by Cassian of Marseille in the 5th century, that looks like it's anything on the scale. If it has, even if it's just one step towards Augustine from Pelagianism, or if it's just one step from Augustinianism towards Pelagianism. I hope I've got that right. But anyway, if you do them as opposite ends, anything in that whole spectrum is semi-Pelagianism if you don't add in the taught by Cassian. Is that too broad of a definition? And then is the what about Cassian of Marseille? What did he actually teach? Is an interesting question, which then would pin it down very specifically. And then if you say it has to be what Cassian taught, is that too narrow a definition? I think that's something we should come to, but we might have trouble ever getting there if we, well, I think if we answer your second point and your third point, then the first point may just fall out by itself. If the right definition is it has to be what Cassian taught, and if Calvinists have been using it more broadly all along since the beginning, then Calvinists have been using it overly broadly since the beginning, if that's the right definition. But if the right definition is anything in between Augustinianism and Pelagianism, then maybe it would be hard to argue that Calvinism has been misusing it, unless, in fact, because of the law gospel point you're raising, actually these other views are not on a spectrum between Augustinian and Pelagianism. They're on a different axis altogether, on a different plane of existence altogether, because of the difference, the fundamental difference between them. So I don't know. Maybe the first point falls out once we address the other two. I'm not sure. But anyway, just in terms of giving a quick summary of the usage, not that the usage is binding, but this is just the usage. It's, as in the first case, associated with John Cassian of Marseille. This is a name that keeps coming up. I have too many L's in Marseille here. It's also used as a polemical term. It's also used as an alternative to sublapsarianism and supralapsarianism. I don't see much value in that particular usage, but it's there. It's mentioned as a way of, in association with promoting liberty of free will, as teaching an ineffectual grace prior to faith. At least that's my takeaway from that very confusing sentence that's from a sermon. I did actually find the original sermon. I don't know if it will make sense to go through the sermon or not. It just really a question of the usage in that context, as acknowledging original corruption, but limiting it. And then as saying, although assisting grace is necessary, the first turn of the will toward God is the result of a man's own choice. Or holding that man comes to, this is like trying to use the exact words that I found so confusing. And then as teaching that Christ died or shed his blood for all men in general, or as teaching the regeneration of divine and human wills are cooperating or synergistic coefficient factors. So, as I said, this is just a usage, not an authoritative definition. For a more authoritative definition, in theory, I thought we would go to some theological dictionaries and encyclopedias. But again,
so let me just ask. Let's take the view that Christ died for everybody is semi-Pelagian. Okay, so who wasn't semi-Pelagian before Gottschalk?
Well, some of the opponents of the Gallic monks were explicitly denying that Christ died for everyone. They would say Christ died only for the elect. Lucidus is accused of that, for example, by the semi-Pelagians.
But he backed down.
Okay, so that is the claim, that they claim he backed down. I'm not saying he didn't back down, or he did. I'm just saying he is an example of someone who is part of that movement. Okay.
Yeah, and the view got condemned by the Council of Arles. So, in other words, limited atonement got condemned by the Council of Arles. So,
which Council of Arles did that, you think?
The one, I think it's what, 472, 473?
I don't know.
I think it's 472. I can look it up. It's definitely in Kurt's dissertation, but I'm sure I can find it.
Well, I mean, we can explore it another time. I would be curious to see what they said there, if there was a statement that was directly on the question of the scope of the atonement.
So 6 points. So Christ died not for all and does not will that all should be saved. That position got condemned by the 472 Council of Arles.
By the 472?
Yeah.
All right, I'll do some research because I had some trouble tracking down the actual texts of any of these councils, and that was.
But do you think there's anybody else before Gottschalk that held to this view, or setting aside Lucian, who I guess held it but then backed down to not get excommunicated? Did anyone else hold to that?
I think so, yes.
Who?
I don't have a list for you. I haven't compiled a list. I don't have a. I don't have an answer for that point. Yeah.
No. So okay. So no, there's no names. Okay. So
well, the name I gave was Lucidius. Was Lucidius? Okay. Yeah.
Right, and he backed down instead of getting booted from the church for holding that view. So, other than that, basically, at least as far as we have documentation, the entire church was semi-Pelagian for 900 years. Now, after Gottschalk and before, let's say, Calvin, anyone else? Any names? Or are we going to limit it to 1.5 names before Calvinists came along?
Well, I certainly, just because I'm not prepared today with a list of names doesn't mean that I think there weren't any people. I don't know where you would come up with that idea that I would say, because I don't have a list of names for you, that I don't think there were other people.
I'm not asking you. I'm asking if you know of anybody. If you don't know anybody, that's fine. But it just seems really weird. That's the definition of semi-Pelagianism, right? I think it's well. Anyways, yeah, this is the exact problem. This is the exact problem with this approach. But okay, I mean, I guess I strongly urge more caution in the way you're approaching this, and just be more open-minded about it, because if not, what's going to happen is you'll just be shunted aside. And
well, I'm not I'm not at all worried about being shunted aside. So we can set that concern to the side. And I'm not too concerned about whether I'm open-minded or not, because I'm just going to the same dictionary that applies to everyone and reading what it says and seeing its usage for the last 300 years before the dictionary was prepared. And I'm taking it as it comes, not cherry picking the ones that I like and the ones I don't like. And I'm acknowledging the weaknesses of it, and I'm acknowledging the positives of it. So I don't feel like I have a problem of not being open-minded about how the terms are defined, even if they're not in a way that's particularly helpful or favorable, including what I see as kind of a bizarre schema, which I acknowledged a minute ago, of sublapsarian, supralapsarian, and semi-Pelagian. That seems like a bizarre taxonomy. And I acknowledge that if you say that, well, on the one hand, yes, the Gallic monks, sometimes referred to as the semi-Pelagians, were advocates on the atonement, on this universal atonement. That was a big deal to them at that time. But does that mean that that should be the characteristic of semi-Pelagianism, or enough that anybody who holds to that is called a semi-Pelagian? If it is, then so be it. But that's just an example of usage that is in the last 300 years of how people have been using the term. It doesn't mean that it's automatically the right or best definition of the term. So I'm not sure, we haven't even, I guess we could go through, but we know that some of those definitions would apply to Leighton. Some of them you can't apply to him at all. Like, one of them was so weirdly worded that it sounded almost incoherent. Like you said, in one way of looking at it, it looks like he said he was denying any grace at all, the way that was worded. That's how it looked, kind of at first reading through. And that would be a bizarre way to characterize semi-Pelagianism. It sounds just like Pelagianism if you say no grace at all. But even Pelagius doesn't have a absolute zero grace position. So in terms of what's a good definition to use, my position in the debate is not going to be, well, we should use the absolute broadest definition that's ever been used for semi-Pelagianism down through the years, the biggest tent, the most popular definition, or the or something like that. I need to have a standard by which I'm going to come up with the definition I advocate for during the debate. So just because, for 300 years, it was used this way, and then for the last 100 years, was it used the same way or differently? We could explore, I guess. I don't think that there's a reason to explore that last 100 years to see how the usage has changed, to see if it's one of these words that shifted its meaning, basically because of the extremely broad range of things, ranging from a very specific historical figure, Cassian, to, like you said, this the universality of the atonement, which presumably has a much wider scope than Cassian's own specific views. So yeah, I'm not worried that, by mentioning the dictionaries and how words are actually defined, that I'm going to be a closed-minded, person who's locked into a corner. That's just not a concern for me.
Okay, I got you, and I appreciate you. So yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. So I get that you're not scared that, I guess, that your position will just be dismissed or whatever. That's cool. I get your bravery in that. That's a good thing. No, but I guess what I'm saying is, what I found interesting about Kurt's work is that he went to the original sources and he did actual research and dug things up and figured out what people were saying back in the day. And I think that's where that his work is quite valuable, into digging into things that maybe others hadn't spent as much time looking at, and he was really trying to figure it out. And I appreciated that about his approach. I wonder if the folks that are that you just quoted from that dictionary did similar research. Now, some of them maybe did, but there wasn't. I don't think there was much evidence. Now, what's interesting, and a more interesting question is, okay, so who in church history has done a lot of homework on Pelagianism and semi-Pelagianism? Like, who actually wrote books on it and spent time on it, dug into the original materials and those sorts of things? Those guys are probably well worth looking at what they came away from when they studied these sources. So anyways, I guess that's just what I would encourage you to focus on, the ones that really did their homework.
So I don't have, in fact, interestingly, where we're headed next is going to go in that direction a bit. But I would point out there is an interesting challenge, which is, there's a question, should semi-Pelagianism be defined according to the teachings of John Cassian, the common teachings of Cassian and who is it now? Faustus. So some people will link them. Some will suggest Cassian and Hilary of Arles as another person to maybe link them up. Or as Kurt does, he puts Vincent and Cassian and Faustus together. There's a number of ways you could do that. Or do you do it negatively and say, basically, it's whatever the Second Council of Orange was attacking? And there's an interesting problem when you do the Second Council of Orange, whatever the Second Council of Orange was attacking, versus what about these Gallic monks, meaning those three that Kurt identifies. We'll call those the Gallic monks. So if you take what the Gallic monks believe and you put it up against what the Second Council of Orange is condemning, and they don't completely align, then you have a little problem. If you're saying that you're trying to get the combination of what those Gallic monks believed, which was condemned by this, and then you say, actually, all the things they condemned are not what they were teaching, what are you going to do? That creates a problem. And that's where people start to say, well, this word doesn't, that type of definition of this word doesn't work. And that's kind of an argument that Kurt's used himself in the past.
Yeah, I guess I disagree with Kurt there. I think that there's a pretty clear distinction between the Council of Orange and the Council of Carthage. They're just superficially different. And the Council of Carthage is dealing with bigger issues. It's just, um, basically people working their way to heaven and that sort of thing. So, um, yeah, I guess that's why I look at those councils as pretty important because at the time the church, at least regionally, came together, looked at the issue, studied it, and came back with definitive statements. It seems like a pretty good way, pretty good touchstone. So Pelagianism probably is best defined as disagreeing with the essentials in the Council of Carthage. Semi-Pelagianism is probably best defined as the disagreement with the main points in the Councils of Orange, and go from there. And at least you've got a standard based in historical theology, and it's they've kind of stood the test of time, right? They're not and they have widespread adoption and that and usage in the church and that sort of thing. So now it's not that you can't look at it. So the question of whether the Gallic monks ended up condemned by Orange or not is interesting, but almost secondary to the definition of the term. Even if no one was condemned by the Second Council of Orange, the fact that the church defined its position and used that definition and held people accountable to it and just used it as a standard for a long period of time gives it value whether or not the Gallic monks were condemned by it.
I mean, so that's an interesting question. How much was it used over the centuries? I'm not 100% sure to what extent it actually was used. It was, at least in theory, authoritative over the centuries because Boniface II endorsed it, approved it. So it became binding in the West. But it wasn't actually, was anyone ever kind of prosecuted under those canons and found to be in violation of them, like ever from that time until the Reformation? I'm not sure.
Not that I've heard of.
Yeah.
No, but I look at it more like there was a big controversy, and that's more or less the last word we hear.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And it is a natural end to the what is called the semi-Pelagian controversy. And it's called that. The weird thing is this: had at the time the label semi-Pelagianism been used of those monks or of the views condemned by the council, if it had been used, then I think we would all kind of feel comfortable saying this is the historical meaning of that term. In the same way that Nestorius' name was attached to those errant doctrines, and it's always been called Nestorianism. It's been called that way since the time of Nestorius. We feel kind of comfortable about it because it goes all the way back to that time. Whereas this label semi-Pelagianism got attached to it got attached to the Gallic monks by essentially the Jansenist branch of the Jansenist controversy. They associated it with that movement and started accusing the Molinists of following the contrary position. So it's brought out as this polemical weapon by one group of Roman Catholics with another group of Roman Catholics. And I'm not sure that the Jansenists were in the right in the way that they analyzed things. I haven't read their writings, and I haven't read their opponents' writings in terms of that controversy they had. So I'm not trying to say that one side was right or the other side was right, but it was brought out, the label was brought out as a polemical term. And I don't know if they meant by that specifically that they violated Second Council of Orange, or just that they were a part of the movement that's associated with Cassian and so forth. I don't know if you have additional insights on that particular aspect of the label associated with that movement.
So, okay, so before Jansen, was the Molinist Dominican controversy. And the main illustration that Molina used that was called Semi-Pelagian is in relation to a very specific work of God, which is in that the quote you had where we talked about auxiliary. So the auxiliary grace. So long story short, it has to do with concurrence with respect to existence. Okay, so the way Molina described it is different. Okay, so the Dominicans called God's concurrence physical premotion. And when I talk about concurrence, here's what I mean. So we exist because God created us, but not just that, he sustains us in existence. That's the reason why we don't pop out of existence. And if God didn't concur, then we would pop out of existence. We would lapse into nothing. So God concurs with our existence. Now, the way Molina described that is that it's like two people drawing a boat in terms of the concurrence. Our causation is real. It is a real world thing, right? So let me give it complicated, but let me give it an example of the opposite of opinion. The opposite opinion is like, think of the world like a stop motion, a cartoon or something like that. You know, have you ever had one of those cartoon flip books where you draw a picture, then you flip the page, then you see the next picture, you flip. Okay, so if God is creating the world every moment, then all causation is from the illustrator to the page, then it's from the illustrator to the next page, from the illustrator to the next page. And whatever is happening, let's say it's like a ball falling in the stop motion, the ball isn't actually falling, it's just being drawn at a different location at a different time. And so there's no causation in the actual world. So Molina said, no, it's not like that. He said, no, there's both at the same time. It's a simultaneous thing where God is sustaining the world in existence, but our causation is exerting itself. In the illustration he used, is like two people drawing a boat. Okay, that simultaneous work.
Drawing a boat, pulling a boat, or drawing a boat, painting a boat?
Pulling a boat. Like, so okay. Two people pulling a boat with a string was his example. God is pulling the boat and we're pulling the boat at the same time. That concurrence sounds like what Cassian taught. Because what Cassian said is grace isn't prevenient. It doesn't come before. It's simultaneous, right? So we start choosing God at the same time his grace starts assisting us. It's not that his grace comes before, it has a causal relation. No, it's simultaneous. So it sounds like that in its isolated context. Now, what's different is Molina did absolutely say, no, God's grace enables us to come. So there's work before the person pulls on the boat that enables the person to pull on the boat. And that's the piece that Cassian didn't have. But people focused on take that in isolation. That concurrent grace that's the issue. And so therefore he's semi-Pelagian. And the Dominicans and Molinists wrangled over this issue. And eventually the Pope just said, both of you stop calling each other heretics, right? Because anyways. So there we are. Now, next comes Jansen.
I would just pause for a second. This is the only reason we're constantly told why we need a Pope. It's because sometimes there's these difficult theological questions, people debate over them, and we need somebody who can solve it because Scripture is not good enough, allegedly. So, how does the Pope solve this eternal debate between the more between the Dominicans and the Franciscans, right?
Mostly it was the Jesuits that were the Molinists and the Dominicans that were Thomist or whatever.
Between the Jesuits and the Dominicans, how do you resolve it? Just both of you shut up. Don't call each other heretics. That's it. That's the solution. Not a clear explanation of Romans 9, but just shut up, guys.
Right.
All right. So continue on. If you want to continue on, I think go ahead.
So, okay, so just real quick. So now fast forward. After the dust settled, next comes Jansen. Jansen is not that way. He's a strict determinist. And he holds to obviously limited atonement and irresistible grace and determinism and all this other stuff. So he's basically as close as you can get to a Calvinist within the Roman Catholic Church, while still holding to contingent merit. And basically, he just says, well, God predestines you to work your way to heaven or something like that. So, he gets himself censured, and ultimately, I think he dies before his views get condemned. So I think Roman Catholics say that because he died before he got, his views got condemned, he's not necessarily a heretic, but he was on his way to getting excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church for essentially deterministic theism within the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay. Let me try to see if we can cover the second part of the definitions that I wanted to cover here. This one should be, the first ones will just be very general, and the third one and fourth one might be more to what you were hoping to dig into, because they have more of a historical emphasis to them. If that's okay.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, getting a call from somebody with a very similar, essentially obvious scam call. So, Semi-Pelagianism in some theological dictionaries and encyclopedias. The first one I went to is the Westminster Dictionary of Theological Terms. I think I picked this one because it was in one of the, I don't know if it was in Allen or Harwood or one of Leighton Flowers' comments. They said even the Reformed do this. And I'm pretty sure this is just the PCUSA's publishing house, not the most Reformed denomination. Although I think they tolerate Reformed people to some extent. They don't, the church as a whole is not specifically or distinctly Reformed. There's some Reformed tradition there, but that's about it. So they define Pelagianism this way, which is the theological views associated with the British monk Pelagius, who in theological debate with Augustine argued for a totally free human will to do the good and held that divine grace was bestowed in relation to human merit. These views were condemned at the Council of Ephesus. So it's a pretty historically defined definition of Pelagianism, saying it's what Pelagius taught and specifically what was condemned at the Council of Ephesus 431. I'm surprised they said 431, not 418. I don't know if there's...
So the Council of Carthage was 418.
Oh, okay.
And then, but it was ratified by the Ecumenical Council of Ephesus later.
That may be what it is. It may be that it was ratified, since it was ratified at Ephesus, but with Carthage 418 is where I would have thought we would have gone. But I'm wondering, is there some other canon from Ephesus that we would want to consider on the question of Pelagianism? I don't think there are any. Are there?
I don't think so. If I remember correctly, it makes a brief reference to Pelagius and Celestius and says their views are condemned. I think it's very cursory.
There's a letter to someone saying that the Pope's decrees against the Pelagians have been read and confirmed. And that's all I can see in this particular summary. So, all right. So continuing on, Semi-Pelagianism, a mediating view of human nature between that of Augustine and that of Pelagius. John Cassian taught that the initial step of faith was taken by a person's own will and that divine grace came later. This view was condemned by the Council of Orange 529. It's a very... So how do you feel about that one?
I think that here, Kurt has done a tremendous amount of helpful work to clarify that this is not true. So
when you say this is not true, that
Cassian did not say this, and not only did he not say this, that it shouldn't be the standard by which this is probably not a good definition for semi-Pelagianism because it's not Cassian's view. So some people will say, well, Cassian denied prevenient grace, therefore the human will comes first. But it's not an either or. For Cassian, they're simultaneous. So this definition shouldn't say that the first step is taken by the person's will. No, the first step is simultaneous with grace, whereas prevenient grace is grace comes first and has a causal relation to our first step towards faith. So even though Cassian denied prevenient grace, he did not say we take the first step. He said it's simultaneous with grace.
So that's an interesting point, and it's something I think it does make me think that we should probably at some point tackle what did Cassian himself hold and go through some of the relevant passages of Cassian's writings that deal with that. I guess a related question is, like, suppose for the sake of the argument that Cassian never came out and said it this way, but that Faustus did, in almost in so many words, come out and say it this way. Basically presented it as God provides the gospel offer to everyone, and then God gives grace to whoever first moves himself towards that, moves himself to respond to the gospel. Then God gives grace to that person. There's certain parts of, and this is another thing we should probably have a separate discussion about. Am I characterizing Faustus right? But if Faustus has this same doctrine and Cassian doesn't, but Faustus kind of develops it, presumably, since Faustus is, the way I picture it at least, Cassian it's kind of earlier in time and Faustus is a little bit later in time. And some people will say that Faustus's work on grace is the kind of culmination of the semi-Pelagian movement at its peak, because it's kind of those councils you mentioned. If I'm not mistaken, the Arles Council you mentioned is the one that commissions Faustus to write what he wrote on grace. And so I think that people, when they say that the council, I could be wrong, but I think when people say that council endorsed or had various views, they're getting that idea of what those views were from Faustus's own books it's a 2-book treatise on grace. They're going to his books, seeing what he taught on grace, and they said, well, that's reflective of what the councils asked him to write. Because we don't have, if I'm not mistaken, we don't have records of those councils themselves, like we do with Orange. So, but regardless, I mean, the question is, if Cassian doesn't go that far, but then Faustus does, and then so what do we do with that? Would it still be validly semi-Pelagianism if Faustus did go that far?
Certainly, in my view, yes. Because, so the way I look at it is not what they're attacking, but what they're defining, right? So what is the Council of Orange saying? Prevenient grace is God's grace comes first, and it stands in a causal relation to any response on our side. So given that, then yeah, both Cassian and Faustus, assuming we're understanding Cassian and Faustus correctly, have a real problem. Because now, they seem like they're outside of Orange.
So in terms of, like, if it said not John Cassian here, but it just said an unknown author taught such and such, this view was condemned by the Council of Orange. You're okay with the idea that this view was condemned, just not okay with the idea that Cassian necessarily, so far you're not persuaded that Cassian is one who taught that, because Kurt's thesis is persuasive to you that, in fact, Cassian didn't teach that. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, that's okay. Right.
All right. I will. So this is just the cover page. It's a 1996 dictionary. It doesn't have the benefit of Kurt's work, because it came before he worked. There's it was a bit brief. This is an even worse definition of Pelagianism from another theological encyclopedia I found. This one says Pelagianism is, quote, the chief heresy of the faith. The teaching that Jesus' sacrifice didn't mean much, since humans were in complete control of their actions and salvation, and therefore responsible for every sin, error, and mistake they made. We bet these guys were a kick at parties. I don't know what? It's such a bizarre. This is from Crazy Talk, a not so stuffy dictionary of theological terms, from 2017. So
Okay.
not all these dictionaries of theological terms are created equally.
Needed something to lighten the mood. Cool.
So yeah, now a more serious investigation of that topic comes from. Not that this is not serious. This is, I think, this represents in some ways a very mainstream view of what the terms are, not polemically, when they're not charged with polemicism, that what the terms are supposed to refer to. I think that that's a fair characterization. But going back to the turn of the 20th century, this is from about that same era as the Oxford English. We have the New Schaff. It's not new anymore, but anyway, it's called the New Schaff Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge. It's a 13-volume encyclopedia of theological religious terms, and it looks a little bit tiny here, but I can blow it up a bit bigger, and you can see there's an entry on semi-Pelagianism, and they start off by describing it as a synergistic view. Here we are. Sorry, a synergistic view raised in opposition to Augustinian monergism. The origin and scope of the term in the history of dogma has not yet been clearly determined. Now, I think that Baucus and Gudrian have done a lot of great work in that area in terms of bringing out the history, and we have discussed that a little bit before in terms of the term. And here he talks a little bit about some of the usage back. He finds it in 1673 being used a certain way, and he talks about it going back to post-Tridentine elaborators of the scholastic theology, but he also mentions Luther's formula of concord, and a reference to in 1601 to an assailed thesis of Louis Molina, and subsequently it became common. So that's his like story of the history of the term. Now, as much fun as that is, and also as much fun as a really, really broad definition that he sort of lays out front, he does actually go on to give more detail, not so much here, although he gets into a little bit here. So in this section, he talks about, sorry to jump around so much. So there's the reference to the Jansenist controversy, and he says that it's evidently the term was to represent that doctrine of sin and grace in which Prosper of Aquitaine opposed the Massilians, and was later represented by Faustus of Riez, and in some points declared heretical by the Synod of Orange, 529. The Synod of Carthage had adopted 8 canons against the Pelagians, and he goes through those 8, or summarizes them in 4 points. And then he notes that the entire Augustinian doctrine of grace wasn't approved. And this is an important point, and I think it goes to your third point, I think, which was basically, if you say that anything that's not up to the gold standard of Augustinianism is semi-Pelagianism, that you're taking this view that's essentially, it's a very rigid view, and it's not reflected in the councils that endorsed Augustinian theology against Pelagius or Pelagian theology. They never quite get to the peaks of Augustine's views, or they take some things that Augustine said and they adopt them, but they don't necessarily adopt all his thinking. And in some cases, some people argue that they push back on Augustine on certain points. So, yeah, it's a kind of a caution to people who are using, the term Augustinian and Orthodox as identical.
So I think this is pretty right on point. So okay, so look at the third and fourth points. Divine grace involves, besides forgiveness, the power to avoid sin, and sinless perfection is impossible on earth. Just put that into the context of Pelagius's view. We believe and are baptized, and our past sins are forgiven. From here on, two ways of salvation. What are the two? Basically, our good works have to outweigh our bad works, but we're not getting any grace to do that, or we have to be sinlessly perfect. So 3 and 4 are directly targeting the Pelagian position. But then what's more interesting to me is I think he's on the right track.
Which is, he's talking about the Synod of Carthage here. So
yeah,
right.
Right.
Which we all, I mean, you and I both agree that it was targeting at Celestius and Pelagius.
But again, they're targeting earning salvation, work salvation, not justification by faith alone. But okay, now let's look at the next part.
Hold on.
Here.
That's what you just said sounded important to me. When you said they were targeting work salvation, not justification by faith alone, what do you mean?
So, okay, the third one, divine grace involves, besides forgiveness, the power to avoid sin. Okay, Pelagius's position, what was it? It's not, there's no change in nature regeneration. It's just a good example, right? Because we are already basically good. So when you come to faith and baptism, past sins are forgiven, but not future sins. And you can't have any future sins, or if you have future sins, you have to put them on the scales, and your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds, right? So 3 and 4 directly target this view of working your way to heaven after you've been forgiven of past sins.
So let me ask you this. Are you saying that the way that those should be interpreted, 3 and 4 should be interpreted, is as denying that people need to live a sinless life after baptism?
The fourth one certainly looks like that, but the third one looks like it's saying that, let's say, in terms of that scales view, well, to put anything on the good scale, you at least need grace. Like, where Pelagius is wrong to say you can put things on the good scale without divine grace. Okay. That's what it seems. So that's what 3 seems to be doing. 4 seems to be saying, no, you can't be sinless,
even with grace.
It's so I think for that level, maybe we should look at the actual Carthage itself. But yeah, possibly it's saying that. But okay, so but I did want to get to so the entire Augustine doctrine of grace then, however, was not approved in this. But now this is interesting. 2 years later, Augustine, in formulating the Pelagian heresy, goes beyond the judgment of the council and stating that the Pelagians assume that the grace by which men are justified was not grace, but upon merit. That's the issue.
That's an issue with whom? With the Pelagians or with the semi-Pelagians?
With the Massilians, with the semi-Pelagians.
So the idea that the grace by which men are justified was not given gratuitously, but upon merit.
Right.
Now, keeping in mind that they have a category for foreseen merit, so the timing of the grace wouldn't be dispositive.
Here, let me see it. Let me share my screen.
Okay.
Let's go with this. Okay. But it's gone. I'll try again.
I don't see the share screen popping up in StreamYard yet from your side. Now I see something. There we are.
Okay, so this is after Pelagius. Now Augustine is addressing the Massilians, right? So those brothers of ours. So it's interesting that he calls them brothers, but he's calling the Massilians brothers, on whose behalf our pious love is solicitous, have attained with the Church of Christ to the belief that the human race is born obnoxious to sin of the first man, and that none can be delivered from the evil save by the righteousness of the second man. Okay, so these guys aren't Pelagian, right? They're not that bad. Now he's getting into the Massilians, not Pelagians, the Massilians. Okay. Moreover, they have obtained to the confession that men's wills are anticipated by God's grace. Okay, so there's some level of prevenient grace here. Into the agreement that no one can suffice by himself, either for beginning or for completing any good work. Interesting. He's not interested in the priority of grace here, because they're ceding that. These things, therefore, unto which they have attained, being held fast, abundantly distinguish themselves from the Pelagian error. Okay, so he's describing them as they're not Pelagian, right? Okay, now he comes back. But I see that I must now reply to those who say that the divine testimonies which I have adduced concerning this matter are of avail for this purpose, to assure us that we have faith itself of ourselves, but that its increase is of God. Okay, so we have faith on our own, but its increase comes from God. But if faith were not given to us by him, but were only increased in us by him, on the ground of merit of its having begun from us. Okay, so we start conversion, and what is called grace. So we start conversion, then God helps us. But what God's grace is not grace, because it is merited. So, in other words, the semi-Pelagian position is that we start things, and when we do, it earns further grace. That's the issue. Thus, there is here no departure from the opinion which Pelagius himself was constrained to condemn in the judgment of the bishops of Palestine, as testified in the same proceedings, that the grace of God is given according to our merits. So they fall back under the condemnation of the Palestinian Council, because if you say you start things, then God helps you, but the help is merited, then you might as well just say you're meriting the whole business, and that's why it falls under the condemnation. Hillary said the same thing. We can look at Hillary's quote, but you want to talk about Augustine here?
Well, that wasn't my primary intent. My primary intent was to kind of go through the encyclopedia discussion, but I'd be curious to get your take on whether this is summarized well by that definition we read earlier, where it says the initial step of faith was taken by a person's own will, and the divine grace came later. That sounds to me like something that Augustine's calling out here. When the first part you have in bold, not that part, the previous part. Yeah. So
the first part sounds, yes, the first part is similar, but it's accurate but not complete. To complete it, you've got to have the second part, or at least you should have the second part, that on the grounds of the merit of its having begun from us. So we start faith, and our starting faith earns whatever help God gives us to finish faith.
That's interesting. Do you see that as an important difference? In other words, do you think that Augustine's objection falls away if the person said, no, the additional grace that God gives after we begin faith is not merited, it's gratuitous on God's part?
He would not fall under this condemnation, that the grace of God is given according to our merits, which is the punchline.
Well, okay, but what if Augustine's response is that the person who's saying that they began faith and that God rewarded that with this additional grace, although they're not calling it merit, but yet when their explanation is, why do some people receive this and not others, the only answer can be found in the deeds of the person, specifically their own initiation of faith.
So Augustine would probably disagree with the position, but what Augustine wouldn't say is that it falls under the judgment and condemnation of the bishops of Palestine. The issue
I don't agree with that, but I'm curious. That's why I'm raising this objection, because I think he would say it still does fall under that.
Why?
Because what's triggering God to give this grace, even if the person is denying that it should be called merit, the reason why God's giving it to some and not others is entirely based on the preceding action of the person, and it is being given as a reward. Even if that's not a strict merit, it's nevertheless given according to the deeds of the person.
So, like I said, I think Augustine would object to that view, but I don't think he would say that it contradicts the bishops of Palestine.
I wonder if
condemnation.
I wonder if we have any responses from his objectors denying that the grace of God is given according to our merits.
It would be in Faust. If it's anywhere, it's going to be in Faust. Hilary basically says the same thing. Just they can be cured of their own illness by the merit of having willed and believed, and that an increase of faith in their total cure follow as an effect. Right. So it's a cause and effect relationship. You're causing God to give you the rest of the grace. They have no nature such as debased, and they think that no nature is so debased and destroyed that it ought not or cannot will to be healed. Yeah, anyways, so it's the idea that you're causing God to give you more, right? So you're doing a little and causing God to give you more, or at least help you with more.
It seems like Hilary's letter to Augustine, the final part that you've bolded there, is saying exactly that. They claim it's not a denial of grace to say that grace is preceded by such a will as can only seek its physician. I mean, that could almost be like Hilary's time traveling and listening to Soteriology 101. Like, I'm pretty sure Leighton would say it's not a denial of grace to say that grace is preceded by a person seeking a physician. I mean, the man doesn't heal himself; he just goes to the doctor. Is that so? Why is that such a big deal?
Again, it's accurate, but I don't think it's complete. Again, I think you got to put it into that context of earning salvation.
Well, I guess my point is, apparently Hilary is saying that if I understand Hilary correctly, based on this, what you posted here, they who think that it's not a denial of grace is the opponents of Augustine and presumably also of Hilary. I don't know. Maybe Hilary is part of the group, or maybe he's not. I'm not sure.
Agreed.
But this statement, they think it's not a denial of grace, makes me think that they're going to say exactly that it's not, that God rewards their faith that comes from themselves with grace, but that it's still grace. And I think Augustine and Hilary are saying, I'm not so sure about Hilary, but I'm pretty sure about Augustine. Augustine's saying, if you receive grace for something you yourself did, that by definition, that you've merited it. Whether or not you call it merit isn't the point. That you call it merit. The point is that you're saying it's a response to what you did.
No, he's saying as an effect of what you did.
I'm not sure what's the difference.
One is free and the other is not. In other words, could God not give the grace?
Well, does he make that argument that it's about God's freedom, or does he make the argument that it's about rewarding something that we do?
He's talking about merit and an effect. The total cure follows as an effect.
Right.
Okay. Anyways, yeah. So I don't. I guess. Okay. Yeah. I mean, carry on. I guess, but
Okay.
this is what this is what Hilary was focused on. This is what Augustine was focused on.
Sounds good. All right. So let me put this back in. So there's a little there is some discussion here, as you mentioned. There were some people who objected to what Augustine had to say, including people in southern Gaul, which includes John Cassian, Johannes Cassianus here, and Hilary, later Bishop of Arles. I don't know if this is the same Hilary or a different Hilary, but anyway, he's grouping him with Cassian as somebody who's objecting, in contrast to Prosper and Augustine. And then I think this may be when he says with serious reverence for the piety and their objections. He objects to this idea of foreknown merit of faith and perseverance. And then Augustine answers with this work on holy predestination. That may have been the one you were just talking about, I think.
It was.
And then this was done with the fraternal spirit, as you said, brothers, earlier in the text. I don't know if you remember, you quoted that and said he calls them brothers. So this fraternal spirit. And after his death, the polemics that were taken up by Prosper became more intense. So when Augustine was at the helm, it was a little bit more fraternal, and then afterwards it became more intense. And so there's some back and forth between Prosper and the Massilians. I don't actually know how to pronounce it correctly, so I'll have to figure that out before the discussion. I'll just call them the Gallic monks and save myself. Against an attack of Vincent of Larens, and then with Hilary resorted to Rome for aid, but Celestine I declined to take an open attitude. He asked them to restrain them from disrupting the unity of the church. If it sounds familiar, it's also the Dominicans and later, but or maybe not Dominicans. But anyway, it doesn't matter who are the people. There's this call for like, just guys, please don't fight. But then Prosper continued writing, and so did Vincent. I'm trying to see if that's what it is. Ultimately, there's these two synods, Arles and Lyon, or Arles and Lyon, which authorized Faustus of Riez to present their doctrine, which was regarded as a heresy on predestination, regarded as a heresy in 450. 20 years later, the Lucidus it says it was recalled in 473. Two synods were authorized. They told Faustus to come up with a book to defend it. He came up with two books on grace, in which Pelagius and the error of predestination were alike denounced, without the conscious advancement of a special doctrine. So that's an interesting, perhaps a little bit favorable way of putting it, like pro Faustus way of putting it. He's not trying to come up with anything new, but just on the one hand, avoiding the errors of Lucidus, and on the other hand, the errors of Pelagius. And then he says, the author of this article says, more in line with the Augustinian tradition were some anonymous writings, two books on the calling of all nations, sometimes ascribed to Leo I. And there's another book called this Hyponesticon against Pelagius and Celestius, which is another anonymous 5th century writing. Apparently Gallic in origin, and it focused on the Augustinian doctrines of grace. So he's kind of going through. It's interesting to read these. I'm not trying to preempt someone going and just reading it themselves, but my point is there's a ongoing conflict. And it says the conflict was renewed in the 6th century from another point of departure between some monks and legates at Constantinople over a formula of the Trinity, where it says one of the Trinity suffered in the flesh, and Possessor, a North African bishop, cited Faustus, and the monks declared Possessor and all those in accord with him to be Pelagians because they had cited Faustus. So basically it got hotter. That somebody put the temperature up a little bit here, and I noticed they're not calling him a semi-Pelagian. They're just calling him, I don't know, he's a Pelagian. so the monks went to Rome to get Hormisdas' support and condemnation of Faustus. But he said he's going to think about it. He kept them waiting for 14 months. But then he ended up writing a letter to Possessor saying that Faustus, like all others not included among the fathers, was incompetent to judge on dogmatic questions. In other words, you shouldn't have cited him to try to come up with this statement, one of the Trinity suffered in the flesh. And the Pope found error in the works of Faustus, but didn't pronounce him heretical. This is like a really nice diplomatic solution. Oh yeah, there's mistakes in there, but he's not a heretic. But you can't cite him for doctrine. So don't cite him, but he's not a heretic. But there's some mistakes. But apparently not a list of mistakes, because we don't have those anyway. Although Hormisdas appealed to the letters of Augustine, sent to Prosper and Hilary in behalf of the true doctrine on grace and free will, it doesn't follow that he recognized the ultra predestinarian view as that of the church. So the what I sometimes call a high Augustinian view, this author calls ultra predestinarian view. It just because Hormisdas sort of endorses it by sending this letter, it doesn't mean that the church actually endorsed it. A fair point. Just an interesting way of putting it, the ultra predestinarian view. From Rome, these Cetic, it says, I'm reading it as Cetic monks, had issued a written appeal to the African bishops in Sardinia to support their Christological and anti-Pelagian views. One of them, Fulgentius of Rusp, responded, and my goodness, there's a lot of details here. The main value of this interaction is that Fulgentius at this time read what Faustus had written, and it irritated him, and he wrote against it quite a lot. I think at one point he wrote 7 books against Faustus. The importance, he says, is it consists in the revival of an interest in Rome for the heritage of Augustine. Meanwhile, in southern Gaul, Caesarius of Arles, who was a pupil at Leuven, and in certain respects esteemed Faustus, was, according to this author, he was a representative of genuine Augustinianism, although from his sermons apparently unconcerned about the irresistible effect of grace. So, very high Augustinian, but he doesn't care about irresistible grace, according to this author. And then at Valence, his doctrine was assailed in his absence. So some of the other Gallic bishops apparently attacked Caesarius of Arles. And I say apparently because we don't have the records of those councils. And he came back with the Synod of Orange, which, interestingly, it says taken from Prosper's theses of the sentences from Augustine. So I haven't checked this out, this detail about Prosper's theses of the sentences from Augustine, but there's 8 negative and 17 positive canons. We've looked at those a little bit before, that those are the canons of Orange. And they say, according to this author, he said these not only negated all Pelagianism, but partly the principles which had become dominant in southern Gaul, a century before, and will probably the opinion of a majority still. The resolutions affirmed the total, and here I have to kind of go back to the next scan, the total moral inability of the natural man to do good, the dependence of all moral human activity upon grace or infused and inspired Holy Spirit, and the prevenience of grace to all merit and human choice and volition. But notice, this is kind of a key point, irresistibility is not affirmed. The disconnection of baptism and the impartation of grace, which may be shown repeatedly in Augustine, is discarded. In fact, baptism is pronounced a vehicle of grace, and an anathema is declared upon those who maintain the predestination to evil, which is the only mention of that doctrine. Boniface II approved those resolutions, and they became the official disposition of this controversy for all time. So, this is kind of the historical plot that this author paints for the semi-Pelagian controversy, so-called. And I think his summary is interesting in terms of this point about a disconnect between baptism and the impartation of grace. According to the way that this author is taking it, this is a rejection of Augustine's disconnect in favor of baptism is a vehicle of grace, like a more something that I guess for those who hold to some form of baptismal regeneration, this would be something that would tend to favor this aspect. And then there's this maintaining predestination to evil point, which I've discussed elsewhere, could discuss another time. But I do think it was interesting to point out this irresistibility is not specifically affirmed, which, again, it would be tempting it would be, what's the right term? Like, if I wanted to say anything short of 5-point Calvinism is semi-Pelagianism, it would be nice to have this council that says grace is irresistible, so that the irresistible grace component lines up. Bottom line is, this is not one of the points that's addressed by the council. The necessary prevenience of grace is addressed by this council, but not the effectuality of that grace, the irresistibility of that grace. That is not addressed by the council, which is one reason to question. He previously claimed, and I mentioned it, was that Caesarius of Arles is a faithful Augustinian, a great representative of Augustine, or something like this. On the other hand, at least in one point, this council is kind of pushing back. And another point, although they're not denying Augustine's view on grace and its irresistibility, they're not affirming it either. So, it may be the end of this controversy, but does it mean that Augustine becomes a doctor of the church to such an extent that you can't really disagree with Augustine without falling into heresy? That's interpreting the Second Council of Orange too broadly. You're overdoing it if you're just saying, if the Second Council of Orange is just saying you cannot touch anything that Augustine said on the doctrines of grace or original sin. No, it doesn't go that far in what it says. So, it's important to acknowledge that, and, yeah.
At least we'll disagree with it in the same way we disagree about the all passages, right? Because I think it's on, Canon 7, where it says that God is helping all men to believe, and I think you would probably just have to read that as, well, just the elect or something.
Are you talking about the places where it might push back against Augustine?
Yeah, so the council says that God is helping all people to believe, or something like that, right? And I think you would just have to say, well, that just means all the elect, like you do with many passages of Scripture, I guess.
Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked with scriptural interpretation questions. I can appreciate that there might be parts of it that actually aren't mentioned here. Like, this one doesn't mention that particular issue. You might be right that there's something to be concerned about there, or I might have a different take on what they're talking about there. But regardless, I think you're in agreement with my main point that I was just making, which is that this, as much as it does push back against some views that are contrary to Augustine, that doesn't turn it into everything that Augustine ever said is gold, and that's what the church is holding now. And if you disagree with Augustine, it's like disagreeing with the New Testament. That's not what the council is saying. That would be a stretch of what the council said by a long shot.
If you construe that passage in the typical Calvinist way, so it says, God makes all men gladly assent to and believe in the truth. Augustine would disagree with that, so it seems like he would be under the condemnation of the council, except he could read the council as all men, meaning the elect.
Right. Well,
otherwise
I think
the council nails him.
Well, maybe we should have a discussion about that.
Sure.
But sure. I can try to make a note of it. Let me see.
Yeah.
I didn't write down earlier, but I should make a note of the and then this was about his makes all men to believe.
Yeah, it's in Canon 7. It says that so the Holy Spirit makes all men gladly assent to and believe in the truth.
Okay. I will try to make sure to address that in a future episode, because I think it will just take a longer time to discuss. Then I don't think I can do it in 30 seconds. Okay. So now we come to the section where it says the view defined, which, just as somebody who reads encyclopedias, I would love they do this at the beginning. If I'm looking for what does the term mean, could they just define it up front? But anyway, they finally do get around to it. The Massilians held Pelagius to be a heretic, accepted the decision of the Synod of Carthage. They concurred in Augustine's doctrine of grace, including the thesis that man requires the inspiration of grace to do good, but they declined the Augustinian monergism. Their synergistic view involved the decision on man's part with reference to eternal life, whether by virtue of his freedom he assented and therefore submitted to the operation of the divine grace, or was indifferent to grace, therefore rejecting it. The Augustinian theses that faith is purely an effect of grace, that grace is irresistible, that no human act, as meritum, is ever to be considered as a cause of the divine operation of grace, that salvation has its basis only in the divine election, these were unacceptable. This view has been designated as semi-Pelagian on the presupposition of the difference between Augustine referring the salvation of those who are saved to the grace of God alone, and Pelagius referring to the same to the possible well-doing of man without the grace of inspiration. Accordingly, the synergism of the Massilians is correctly presumed to be half Pelagian, and the discovery by Augustine and Prosper of relics of Pelagianism is, from their point of view, well-founded. But so
can you scroll up a little, like here?
I'm sorry.
Down a little so we can see the text. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Go ahead.
But it's improper to make the doctrine of the grace of Augustine as a whole, never recognized by the church, the standard with which to compare a heresy. Semi-Pelagian it was, for in common with Pelagius, its thought was anti-Augustinian, not only on points of Augustine never approved by the church, but also on theses whose negation was later expressly condemned. But no Pelagian thought condemned by the church of that time has ever been pointed out in it. Was semi-Pelagianism something other than the anti-Pelagian popular Catholicism of the time? The departures from Augustinian doctrine not censured at Orange should not be designated semi-Pelagian. So he takes a pretty strong view here that if you depart from the things where, if you depart from Augustinian doctrine in a way that's censured by Orange, you should call that semi-Pelagianism. But if it's not censured, then even though it's not fully Augustinian, you should not use the term semi-Pelagianism for that. That's this encyclopedia author, Lufs is his name. It's Lufs' view. Sorry, to continue. So now he comes to what's really the nub of his definition. As a censured heresy, its distinctive marks are 1, a denial of prevenient grace; 2, a refusal to recognize that faith was a gift of God; 3, refusal to regard the natural man as totally incapable of doing good, making the spontaneous cooperation of a man a condition to the operation of grace; and 4, presuming grace to be imparted in consequence of, quote, some merit. A broader definition of the content and scope of the concept of semi-Pelagianism devolves upon a critical consideration of the development of the Roman Catholic Church. The attitude of the Roman Church to Augustine is untrue to fact. This is where he's like chiding them. He's like, here's where he goes. He says, he's the doctor of the church, yet his doctrine of grace has never been officially sanctioned. The later development, even that which has official sanction, has drifted away in the direction characterized by semi-Pelagian thought. This untrue attitude arises from the obscure perplexities which were to be left alone in the adjustment of the semi-Pelagian controversy. The decision of Orange is equivocal. Thorough Augustinianism may add to the sentence that all the baptized should be able, if they will, to labor faithfully to become perfect, that of Augustine. If God have compassion, if God have compassion, we also exercise will. On the other hand, the idea of resistance to grace is not prohibited. This position appears already in the Hypomnestikon antedating semi-Pelagianism. So this is that 5th century anonymous work that we mentioned before, which is opposed to some of the views of Pelagius, but is not. But it was before Cassian, apparently. Here, all the unbaptized, even the dying infants of Christians, remain subject to the uncertainty of predestination. Merely the fact of their being non-elect is the reason why grace has never sought their rescue. But with reference to the baptized, the anti-Augustinian tendency was triumphant, for even if the non-resistance of the elect was not taken as the ground of their election, yet the predestination to death of reprobates was grounded upon the foreseen demerit of their resistance, involving also the conditioning of election on the failure of the foreseen resistance. So Augustine's doctrine was thus uprooted. For all the baptized, the decision of eternal life rested upon free will. I'll pause here because my throat is scratching.
I'll keep rolling. So, to such thought, the revival of the predestination doctrine of God's shock seemed to be heresy. Therefore, this view of the document. Go ahead. Take it from here.
This view. So, to the thought of these people, the revival of the predestination doctrine by God's shock seemed to be heresy. Therefore, this view of the Hypomnestikon may be termed crypto semi-Pelagianism.
Here we go. Okay.
And the Franciscan theology of the 13th century passed beyond this, with the aid of the distinction coming down even from the 5th century of grace general, grata data, this general giving, this general gracious giving of grace, if I read it correctly, and saving grace, and meritive of congruence and merit of basically congruent and condign merit. The semi-Pelagian representations appeared in new garbs. These views may be termed neo-semi-Pelagianism. The two latter may be justly charged against the Roman Church of the present, meaning of 1912 or so.
So mostly, I agree with that. Mostly, I agree with what he's saying there. I think he's on point.
So, if for the sake of a cordial, scholarly, you can't quite see it because of our where we are. But for the sake of a cordial scholarly debate, if we focused on the censured heresies as Loofs describes it, and Loofs was a church history professor at the time. I looked up his credentials somewhere else. But anyway, if we look at his definition, a denial of prevenient grace, the only reason to say that Soteriology 101 doesn't fall within this description is because they call other things grace that are not prevenient grace within the context of this discussion.
Agreed.
Number two, a refusal to say that faith was the gift of God. I don't know, but I feel like they pretty explicitly deny that faith is a gift of God, unless they mean that as a general ability to believe things is a gift of God. And again, that's a strange way of viewing it.
Or just the information. The information enables you to respond. Yeah.
The third one, refusal to regard the natural man as totally incapable of doing good, making the spontaneous cooperation of man a condition to the operation of grace. If you stopped before the making, I think it's fair to say that without this even without that clause, that describes Soteriology 101's point. They don't think man is totally incapable of doing good. They just think he's drawn towards sin and eventually will sin, but not that he's totally incapable of doing good. Now, the spontaneous cooperation of a man, a condition to the operation of grace. I don't know if they would accept that characterization, but I think
they would.
I think it's a fair characterization, whether they would accept it or not. And then, presuming grace to be imparted in consequence of some merit. This is oddly in the quotation marks. Now, they wouldn't agree with the use of calling it merit, because they would say faith is not meritorious.
Exactly. So the rub is going to be on the second and fourth points as far as this goes in terms of your debate. But and I've been getting to the point where I'm annoying about the fourth point. But I feel very strongly that needs to be factored in. And a lot of people don't. A lot of people drop that fourth point.
I think it should be discussed. I'm not 100% sure that the conversation that I'll be having with Kurt was the ideal place for that. But maybe it will be. I don't know.
Maybe not. I don't know. That's a good question.
So that was this is Mr. Loofs, Friedrich Loofs. I love his epic mustache.
Yeah, it's on point.
And I have a summary on the blog post, including quoting those 4 points, which are something we have to consider. The final place I went to is this hefty tome called Augustine Through the Ages. Augustine Through the Ages is an encyclopedia. Erdmann's published it. It's a great go-to for knowledge about Augustine and things Augustinian. So it's a useful place to go when talking about the semi-Pelagianist controversy as it pertains to Augustine and Augustine studies. Interestingly, this particular author is an associate professor at Oxford. He's in their church history department. He's contemporaneous. This is a recent, I think he's still teaching and so forth. It's relatively recent. It's not ultra theologically conservative. I don't know if that matters to Kurt or not. I assume not. But in any event, he puts it this way. He says the terms often used to characterize the thought of a number of Gallic Christian writers of the 5th century, especially Cassian and Faustus. In view of their relationship between grace and free will in the process of salvation, they are conventionally seen to have veered away from Augustine's uncompromising teaching on the absolute power of God's predestination of souls. Their goal, as understood by the opponents, was to leave some scope for the initially independent action of the human will in choosing or refusing to accept the help of God's grace. A theory of the will which, in the eyes of Augustine and his disciples, veered close to the error of Pelagius. So far, I think it's a pretty neutral description of the situation, and I think it dovetails with what we've already seen in other places. Once we got away from the kind of the general broad usage that's been thrown around throughout the centuries. Much patristic scholarship has judged this to be at least partially accurate. This is where things get complicated. Now, I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that this book was published a little bit before Kurt's work. I don't know if he would think that it needs to be updated based on his work, but I believe it was published before. Yeah, it was published in 1999. So I believe that that it doesn't take into account any of his work. But anyway, it's some similar points, as you'll see. So it's partly, at least partly right. From the 420s, a semi-Pelagian, and notice he's putting it in quotation marks, controversy is seen in Gaul between strict Augustinians who didn't question the omnipotence of grace and a heterodox party of Cassian and Faustus. The controversy is understood to have continued until the 6th century, at which point it was condemned at the Council of Orange, presided over by Caesarius of Aros. That's a very summary description of the history. It says, modern scholarship now regards this traditional view with grave misgivings. So, this is kind of the view of we need to stop using this label because it's misleading, or in his case, where he goes to first is it's an anachronism. It was first put into circulation in the late 16th century in debates between Dominicans and the Jesuit Louis de Molina, and it was the Dominican contention that Molina's doctrine of grace, which looked to safeguard free human cooperation with God's will, was a species of Pelagianism. So, I should also add, he says some scholars would refuse the term altogether, and I think Kurt has identified himself as being in that category of preferring to just abandon the term, and few would use it without qualification. So, in other words, the current scholarly view, or current as of 20 years ago, scholarly view was to not use the term anymore, or to use the term but qualify it in some way. Continuing on, let's see if this is readable. Hopefully it is. If not, I have the original paper here. Molina's opponents went on to identify a semi-Pelagian tradition on which they perceived him to be drawing, namely naming its leading exponents as Cassian and Faustus. The controversy over his work, Molina's work, was not fully resolved. Excuse me. But this semi-Pelagianism, in quotes, of the 5th century Gaul immediately became a standard point of reference in counter-Reformation patristics and beyond. The history of Pelagianism, Norris, who was an Augustinian, firmly identified Cassian and Faustus as allies of Pelagius. Scholarship of later centuries showed the term could equally serve the need of Protestant apologetics, and Harnack said semi-Pelagian was an apt description of the medieval Catholic tradition as a whole. Only with Luther was the church restored to a proper adherence to Augustine's teachings. The polemical charge carried by semi-Pelagianism has made modern scholars suspicious of the term as a descriptive or analytic category. And you can see why when you see like other things like this semi-Pelagian alloy, half-faced groat. Yeah, that's very polemic.
Crypto. Crypto neo semi-Pelagianism.
In recent decades, this is talking about the late 20th century, 3 points have emerged from secondary literature in the field that revise the traditional view. First, it's stressed that these semi-Pelagians, whatever their views of Augustine's teachings on grace were not disciples of Pelagius, whose works they explicitly rejected. So I think on this point, I mean, it's hard not to say that, at least with their lips, they explicitly rejected Pelagius. On top of that, I think it's fair to say that if Pelagius had an influence is one thing, but to say that they followed exactly what he said, I think it would be hard to say that, because there are places where their views contradict what Pelagius said. So it's not just that they say, oh, Pelagius, that heretic, and then go on to repeat the same doctrines. Maybe there was some influence, but that's quite different between just having some influence and being disciples of Pelagius or something like that. So mostly I can just agree with this first of the 3 points. Second point, now accepted that the theological questions of grace didn't exert the same polarizing force in that culture as they did in the world of the early modern scholars who devised the history. So there's no continuous debate on these topics. A burst of treatises around 430, the work of Faustus 40 years later, and its reopening of the question nearly 60 years later don't constitute a unified controversy. On this point, I have to disagree a little bit. I mean,
it got pretty hot, yeah.
when we read that, now I agree that the previous encyclopedia we read is like almost 100 years before this one. But even there, you can see a lot more to the controversy than just like a couple of letters written back and forth every 50 years. that's a reductionist view, and it's particularly bizarre because I didn't copy all of the entry here, but the entry goes on to start talking about the whole controversy and goes into more detail. So I think that's an oversimplification. Maybe it's true, though, that the topics were more polarizing in the 17th century or the late 16th century than they were in the 5th century or early 6th century. That might be true. The part that it was more polarizing in the late 16th century, early 17th century, as compared to the earlier, maybe that part's true. But again, I don't think that says that there's no controversy. There were people getting kicked out of their churches over the issue. But anyway, thirdly, he says we have been reminded that the Council of Orange did not explicitly condemn Faustus of Fries. He's not mentioned by name in the decrees, nor did it unequivocally reassert the teaching of Augustine. The achievement of the council was, in fact, to strike a workable compromise in such a way as to preempt future conflict. So it was a diplomatic solution to the conflict, not a win for Augustine, per se. And Faustus of Fries isn't mentioned by name in the decrees. I kind of agree with this point that I 100% agree he is not mentioned by name. I'm not 100% sure that his views are not criticized, but condemning him as a person and criticizing his views are two different things. They're both for me, and I think also for this council. So I think they do object. I think there are things he says that they don't accept, but I don't think that they necessarily kick him out of the kingdom or something like that over those differences. Although, if he were to be alive when they had come out with their canons, he might have had some hard choices about whether to accept them or be under their anathema. He says, these cautions established, scholars are beginning to revisit the scene. Revisiting the scene of the Semi-Pelagian controversy with new problems and questions. The canon of texts traditionally associated with the controversy is now seen to represent an opportunity to chart the influence and reception of Augustine around the Western Mediterranean in the century after his death. And then it goes through, and the next 4 pages are the actual controversy laid out piece by piece, step by step. This controversy is not a controversy.
Can we get to the bottom line? Does he ever say, here's what Semi-Pelagianism is? It's fine if we don't.
So the closest he comes on that is, in terms of defining it, is right up front when he provides this. He says, as understood by their opponents, they wanted to leave some scope for the initially independent actions of the human will in choosing or refusing to accept the help of God's grace. So this, that's the condemned thing, according to this. And then, was there another one? I don't recall. Let me just double check. I think he doesn't give much more definition than that, because he's basically saying that this term tends to have a lot of polemical charge to it, and we don't necessarily need to be using the term. So
I'm going to have to wrap up on my side. Just have
okay.
Other things. So I apologize.
I will try to run through the comments, or are there any you want to get before you left, or you just you're welcome to, or not, whatever you like. No pressure.
There's a couple. Okay, I don't think justification by faith is the focus of the debate, but total inability and prevenient grace is the focus. True. Yes, that's right. That's because, frankly, both sides, both Augustine and Pelagius and Faustus, and the people at the Council of Words, they all held, or at least they did not clearly articulate a doctrine of justification by faith alone. None of them did. And all of them, at least at times, seem to be talking about merit in ways that I find very troubling. Now, it is true that they didn't define things in hard and fast terms the way the Council of Trent did, 1,000 years later, but it is a big problem that they're talking about merit and works and that sort of thing. So, yeah, justification by faith alone wasn't the issue at this historical debate, but the question is, they are seeming to place weight on meriting God's help. And that's where if somebody holds to justification by faith alone, are they just, kind of dodging out of that whole question? So it comes down to that fourth point that we saw in the summary of, the role of merit. Is that a part of the semi-Pelagian definition? So anyways, that's my my spiel.
All right. My own take is a bit different on that, but because I do think that Augustine held to justification by faith alone. So we have some very different take on that. But I'm not, and some people who hold to justification by faith alone, in one sense, sometimes, like Pelagius, will say things like someone's justified by faith alone, but what he means by that doesn't always line up with what we would accept as justification by faith alone. So in his Romans commentary, I think he does say man is justified by faith alone. But then what does he mean by that? That's an important question. And it doesn't, for me, Pelagius's answers don't satisfy me. So,
okay. All right. Very good. There's another question, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to address it adequately. So I probably should leave it at that.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
Well, okay. So you're going to carry on. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I know I kind of held my ground, and we disagree, but that's okay. That's kind of, it doesn't matter. I love you anyways, and it doesn't matter. So, anyways, thanks.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
The disagreement from my side, the disagreement is good. This prevents this from being an echo chamber of just, hey, look at how bad those provisionists are. No.
Very good. All right, brother. And thank you to everybody. Appreciate it. God be with you.
Also with you, Dan. So I'll try briefly. I'm not going to stay on much longer. I'm going to try briefly to answer the questions that I saw here. Jamie asks, what percentage Pelagian can you be and still be saved? God knows the right answer of how bad can your theology be and you can still be saved. I'll kind of leave that to God. I don't think we should try to see how far we can get from the truth without perishing. But I would say if you're seeking salvation on the basis of your own works, that sounds to me like you're not seeking salvation through Christ alone. So if I were in such a position, I would not have any assurance of salvation. So that's my answer on that point. Thanks again to Nick for his clarification about King James versus King Charles. Charles the First, not the current Charles the Third, was the king in 1626, I suppose. Thanks to Colin. We appreciate your watching. Thanks to Patrick. I don't know, some of the comments I'm just going to skip over. I see the Freed Thinker is commenting. He said, so far Flowers and company cannot show a substantive difference between their views and semi-Pelagianism, but when they attempt to do so, they just show that they don't deny the gospel is necessary, and semi-Pelagianism affirmed that. I don't know if you've seen the other videos we've done. Some of them have been responding to Leighton Flowers' own defense of himself, and I think his defense is very telling on these points. When he goes to affirm that grace comes before man's initial step. It is graces like the grace of nature, or the grace of having a mind, or the grace of the gospel itself, and not prevenient grace in the kind that we're talking about in this historical context. Let's see. The free thinker goes on to say their difference isn't a difference, and that the free thinker, doesn't care whether it's a quote-unquote heresy or not, but just be honest about it. Well, yeah, I agree we should try to be honest about it, what we believe. The free thinker asks, can we as Augustinians, so Dan, I don't think Dan would want to call himself an Augustinian. I could be wrong. I'll let him try to answer that another time if he wants. I would consider myself Augustinian. Can I give a substantive difference between my views and Gnosticism? And of course, the answer is yes. Now, if Dan, to the extent Dan falls under the false accusation of Gnosticism from people like Wilson, yes. I mean, there's lots of ways, but just taking the example of the most common accusation of Gnosticism promoted through this Doc Wilson's book that talks about this divine unilateral predestination. He compares it to Gnostic concepts, but the Gnostics thought, apparently, that there were some people that are just created with such an evil character that they do the evil things, and that some people were created with a good character and therefore do good things. By contrast, Christians believe that after Adam's fall, everyone who's born has a nature that's evil, that tends towards evil, and that the only thing that converts them out of that is God's gracious miracle working in their hearts to change them, so that by nature, they just continue down the path towards destruction. Everyone does. And that it's God's grace that makes a difference between people, not their created nature is different between people. Let's see. There's some back and forth from earlier. Nobody likes being labeled a Pelagian. Calvinists are immune, at least. You might think we're immune, but remember what I mentioned is just the phrase "faith alone" is in Pelagius's Romans commentary, and someone has pointed that out to me before. That the very first, because I defend sola fide, that the first person to use this sola fide as the translation there is Pelagius. So we get some attacks. Let's see. This one says, no one has commented on the fight between Jake Paul and Nate Diaz. I have no idea what fight that is. I assume it's a MMA or something like that. Well, it should be a very different kind of debate. Let's see. Next up, defining Gnosticism. Well, so this is a serious point. I understand that Leighton likes to throw around this term Gnosticism as a kind of way of trying to turn the tables on Calvinists and say, aha, you're going to call us semi-Pelagians or Pelagians, we're going to call you Gnostics. Which I find to be a bit disingenuous if their reason for doing it is they think that they're being unfairly labeled those things, and so they are therefore in turn unfairly labeling Calvinists. That's just doing evil in response to doing evil, if that's how they see it. Now, if they realize that they are semi-Pelagians or Pelagians, and therefore they're using this label out of frustration because they think Calvinists are Gnostics, and they just don't like hearing it, then okay, but I'm happy to have that debate and explain the differences. And others have already done so. Others have walked through Gnosticism and explained how, Calvinism has nothing in common with a religion that says that our souls are all going to become part of the Milky Way in the end. It's two different religions. It's not the same religion. It's not an overlapping religion. And the similarities are not particularly interesting, but we can address it at whatever time This question, it seems impossible to agree to what extent Pelagius himself was Pelagian. This is another thing that has been, lurking around a bit. And part of the problem, of course, is his works aren't entirely preserved. Some of them are preserved in ways that are suspect, and some of them are preserved more carefully. And the ones that are preserved don't tend to be the ones where he's raising his most objectionable points. So, the people, he gets condemned as a heretic, his works are criticized, and of course, who's going to want to be holding a book of condemned heresies? It's not going to be the most popular thing. But other of his works have survived because he's a smart guy and a good writer, apparently. So he said, the Freethinker says, so if the Gallic monks aren't semi-Pelagian, then so be it, but a second Council of Orange defined the concepts that have defined semi-Pelagianism for over a millennia. Well, I mean, the label, just as a clarification, the label has only been around for about 500 years. And it was invented apparently by Beza. And it wasn't invented to apply to them by Beza, but the debate over Molinism generated a label, applied it to those monks and their presumed teachings or their believed teachings, and then it was applied in this controversy over Molinism. So, but the council teachings have been around for a long time, for sure. Let's see. Where is that definition to be found? A specific council. I don't know which definition, Paul, you were referring to. If you're talking about the definition of semi-Pelagianism, there's not a specific council that uses that phrase, but the Second Council of Orange is a council that's viewed as the end of that controversy. And we just, explored that in a couple of encyclopedia entries with a similar story to tell, one from 100 years ago, one fairly recently. I don't think you'll find that different a view out there. I know that when they're confronted with scholars, the Soteriologies 101's response has been, oh, you can find scholars who will support anything. But these aren't just any scholars who will just support anything. These are scholars over and over again throughout history. And I'm not just picking out the most wild-eyed definitions that are found in a standard work like the Oxford English Dictionary. It has a range of uses, from wildly polemical to fairly not frothing at the mouth. But we're not trying to do that. We're just trying to give an accurate take. Let's see. Discerner says he's a semi-Calvinist. Be careful, you may get kicked out from whatever church you're in if you're a semi-Calvinist. But let's see. 2.5 out of the 5.2. That's exactly semi. All right. Let's see. What else is there? Hey, let's see. I'm trying to look. Sorry, reading through the comments. It's giving you some dead air. I see there's a lot of comments back and forth. The side comments sometimes crack me up. This is one of them. Nobody believes free will can change us into a penguin. So, all right. So Discerner, I think you're kind of just having some fun, but you might be surprised what people seem to think they can do these days. It's just so bizarre. Oh, and I see someone's already addressed that in the comments. All right. So Paul Anker says, if you believe in prevenient grace, I think it's fair to expect an explanation of what change it makes in those who do not believe, for those who are skeptical. I suppose so. But that's not really the focus of our preparation here. I know that's more of a question for Dan, who had to leave after several hours of talking. Let's see. Question, if it all boils down to Chapa defending free will. Where's the question? Dan does believe in libertarian free will. I don't think that's the basis for his concern here. I think his basis is exactly what he said, and he has three main points. And God willing, we'll address those in a separate discussion. I would prefer just to take him at his word. Those, if he says there's these 3 points that he are his reasons, let's focus on those, and not just assume that it's another reason. I don't see what good would come from that. Let's see. My goodness, there's a lot of comments. The Free Thinkers talks about hyper crypto proto semi-Pelagianism, and I'm not a big fan of these tacking on additional qualifiers. So there was towards the end of one of the encyclopedia articles, there was talk about crypto semi-Pelagianism and then neo semi-Pelagianism. Michelle asks, I wonder if we would have seen Leighton deeply reading of the Reformers back when he was Reformed. I don't know. I don't know if he was Reformed. I think he says he was Calvinistic. And there's sometimes a little bit of a difference. But in any event, I don't know what he read at the time. You don't have to read a lot to be Calvinistic. Let's see. Just looking through. A lot of Arminians connect prevenient grace to the gospel proclamation or similar spiritual channels. It's not necessarily universal, although a case can be attempted. Usually I don't know what you're counting as Arminians, but an idea of prevenient grace isn't the proclamation of the gospel itself, usually. So let's see what's else here. Can someone remind us what the debate is going to be about? So I assume the debate will be about this. I originally posted the 8 canons that are negative, the 8 negative canons of the Second Council of Orange. And then I posted tweets from Soteriology 101, which, as I understand the tweets and as I understand the canons, are in conflict. In other words, there are some anathemas in the Second Council of Orange, and in each case, I think those anathemas apply to the teachings of Soteriology 101. And I was challenged then to a debate over whether or not provisionism is semi-Pelagian. My initial pushback had been, what I'm saying is they don't comply with these canons, but I was asked to have a debate on specifically whether they're semi-Pelagian. So I tend to be a person who says, what's in a name? So what if we stopped calling them semi-Pelagian and so started calling them Cassianites? Is that going to make it happy? Are they going to be happy then if we say Cassianites or Faustians? Is that going to be good? Can we call it Faustianism? Is that going to solve the problem? And now we can just identify their teaching with a label that's historically connected to Faustus. Is that going to make them happy? I don't know. Hard to say. Let's see, some more questions that were more for Dan. And Nick says, the more popular you become, the more comments will come. I don't know. I don't anticipate getting very popular. So I don't have that kind of charisma that's going to make me very popular. But that's okay. Hopefully those who are seeking edification through these will get it. I want to thank each of you who commented today. Nick, Michelle, Jamie, Paul Anker, Nick Riob and Nick Sayers, Discerner, Jamie, Russell, Christian Middle Earth, The Freed Thinker, Paul Anker, Patrick Brennan, Raymond O'Flaherty, Jamie, Russell, Christian Middle Earth, Paul Anker, I think I did cover you already, Jason Page, whose comment was very terse, and I don't know. I'm not 100% sure what he was talking about. It's okay. The Paul Anker, if I didn't mention you earlier, and Colin Brooks, and Samuel Haupt, and G. Atlas as well. Thank each of you for joining, for commenting, for hanging out with me. And thanks, Nick, for thinking I'm cool already. And finally, Paul's last question, I think. So each person who hears the gospel should be enabled by prevenient grace, which implies that his resistance to the gospel is 0 or not. So, Paul, I don't know if you're asking me to answer for Dan, who's not here. If you're asking me to answer for Dan on the question of prevenient grace, my understanding is Dan's view is when we're born, we don't have the ability to respond positively to the gospel call. So anytime, if we didn't receive prevenient grace, anytime we heard the gospel, we would just decline and refuse and never agree with the gospel. But God mercifully gives people an ability to either say yes or no, not to definitely say yes, but either to say yes or no to the gospel. Whereas before they could only say no, now they can say yes or no. And then some people choose yes, and some people choose no. And in fact, I think that Dan suggests that that's either universal. This prevenient grace is either universal or almost universal or something like that. But I have to leave the details of his explanation to him. I don't speak for him. I'm just trying to clarify. I accept that prevenient grace may comply with the Second Council of Orange, but I don't think it's right just because it complies with the Second Council of Orange. So I think that the irresistible grace that Augustine taught, which isn't specifically mentioned in that council, is the right view. I'm willing to say it's the right view, but it's not explicitly taught by that council. So, all right. So I will leave it there, and thank you all. God be with you.